BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Friday, another Anything Goes Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we truly begin. And the first is that for a while now, this show has been brought to you by BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88 allows you to make a donational contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. I've talked to you about that many times over the last year. But now there is the BlackBoxOnlineRadio membership, which is going to allow you to have all kinds of extra benefits, as well as membership perks and bonus features. And there is a link to BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88 with all of the info in the description box at the end of this episode. I invite you to check it out. And other than that, I would like to get right into today's topic. And back in 2019, I did several episodes on the Benoit murders. It actually carried on into 2020, and they were the older black box recordings where there was literally just a black box on the screen, and I decided to do a more updated version where I would look at some of the comments that I had made in the past, partnered with some new comments, and put everything together for this episode, because this is coming out in June of 2023, and it's been more than 15 years since the Benoit murders, 16 actually, as we approach the anniversary. Chris Benoit was a professional wrestler who was the sole perpetrator of a double murder-suicide back in 2007, and it took the wrestling world by storm. It took the nation by storm, because not only was he a famous professional wrestler, he was also one of the most loved and well-respected professional wrestlers, and this was back in the height of my pro wrestling fandom, when I watched every single broadcast, Monday Night Raw, Friday Night SmackDown, as well as Tuesday Night ECW, and I even watched the TNA Thursday night episodes. I mean, I was just pulled into that world, and I remember that they were supposed to do a 3-hour special on the USA Network for WWE Raw, but that 3-hour special had to have been canceled because of the tragedy, because of the death of Chris Benoit, which they didn't reveal as a double murder-suicide at the time. They simply posted a photo of him and said that he had passed away, and I remember watching it live thinking, oh my goodness, what on earth happened? I mean, because Chris Benoit was a professional wrestler who was supposed to compete for the ECW championship. And, I mean, what was revealed afterward is that throughout the wrestling storylines, Chris Benoit was supposed to become the ECW champion. Again, this is somebody who would have been at the top of his game with pro wrestling. He was also a former world heavyweight champion, someone who wasn't just a bottom-of-the-barrel wrestler. He wasn't just a pro wrestler scraping by. He was a former champion, and he was a number one contender, more or less, someone who was at the top of his game. And as previously stated, people loved him, they respected him, they thought that he was an extremely talented and capable wrestler, they thought he was an extremely good in-ring performer, and his World Heavyweight Championship victory, where he made Triple H tap out with a crippler crossface, is still by what some people say is still one of the best victories and one of the best victory celebrations in the entire history of pro wrestling, even though Chris Benoit went on to do some very, very heinous things. And a real tragedy took place when it came to the deaths of his wife Nancy and their son Daniel, because after that 3 hour special, which they did as a tribute to the life and career of Chris Benoit, which was made very very quickly and abruptly, the WWE shared more details and said that there was a double murder suicide that took place. Now the details of the crimes have been shared in a couple different ways. And the story has been evolving because over the years more information comes out. At the time, in the late 2000, like at the end of the decade, 2007, 2008, 2009, the story that had been shared was that Chris Benoit had been sending some bizarre text messages, and he called another pro wrestler named Chavo Guerrero, and he said, "Chavo, I love you," in a very odd way. And the details of the murders were that his son Daniel had been strangled with a wrestling choke, and his wife Nancy had been strangled while he was kneeling on her back. But the Dark Side of the Ring episodes, it was actually a two-part episode, which I responded to in an old black box recording, shared some additional information that Nancy was actually strangled with a phone cord and Daniel was suffocated. But the fact of the matter is, it's almost universally accepted that Chris Benoit was the sole perpetrator, and I will talk about the alternative conspiracy theories in just a second, but that he then went on to commit suicide himself by hanging himself from his own weight set, like his own exercise equipment. The Dark Side of the Ring special was very, very in depth because they also shared some shockingly dark and sinister information, and that is that it was highly likely that the murders took place and that Chris Benoit placed Bibles by the bodies of his dead wife and son, and then he went to sleep in his own bed, and then he got on the computer and was reading about resurrection in the book of Elijah, like how to resurrect a child, and then they believe at that point he started contemplating his own suicide, meaning that some type of destructive action took place, and then he went on to just think about what his options were and realize that he had done something extremely heinous and there was no going back, and that is when he decided to commit suicide himself. There were also alcoholic bottles that were found, meaning like alcoholic containers, beer bottles. Okay, I was trying to use a more technical term, but yes, bottles that had alcoholic beverages in them that were empty that were found around. And the questions that people were exploring is, what would drive this individual to murder his wife and son and then commit suicide? Someone who had not shown or revealed any of these types of behaviors in the past. As I said, a very well-respected and well-loved member of the WWE. And it's just been explored in countless ways because, number one, there is the concept of pro wrestling and the injuries, the head injuries that wrestlers experience. I mean, taking chair shots to the head is one thing, getting hit over the head with a steel chair. Chris Benoit was also famous for being one of the few wrestlers who would take a chair shot to the back of the head, and one of Chris Benoit's signature moves was the diving headbutt, and I don't know why he would have done that. I mean, it was when he would climb up on top of the ring, on top of the top turnbuckle, and do a headbutt while flying or diving down onto the opponent. And almost every time, you could see that it hurt him more than it was hurting the opponent. Like, he was actually taking the full force, and I mean, there's a lot of staging in wrestling, but there is a lot of real pain that goes on in wrestling, and that there could be real connections to CTE. And yes, indeed. I mean, Chris Benoit's brain was examined, and it determined that there was a particular type of protein in his brain that was forming and affecting his mental judgment, and there were warning signs about this. Why would somebody go on to murder his wife and son? There were clear warning signs. They were even addressed by his wife, Nancy Benoit, which she made the statement of, he had 30 routes mapped out to the gym so that he couldn't be followed. I mean, we're talking about paranoia. We're talking about things like impulse control. We're talking about things like having some type of mental instability. And there was a website out there and a YouTube channel called WrestleLamia. For the longest time, I thought it was actually called WrestleMania, but it's actually WrestleLamia, LAMIA, WrestleLamia. And they talked about the things that they believed were driving factors and contributing factors to Chris Benoit committing this double murder or suicide. And that is that number one, as we said, brain damage from wrestling. Number two, drugs. Number three, steroids. And number four, an unknown dark side. And I think the points that I had just shared from Nancy Benoit were more about the unknown dark side. And after Chris Benoit died back in 2007, I remember so many people were giving descriptions of him saying he was a private person, even including the former pro wrestler Chris Jericho, who went on national television talking about being a close friend of Chris Benoit and saying just that Chris was a very private person and he didn't share a lot. And I know this isn't meant to be taken super seriously, but the stand-up comedian Chris Titus did a bit, not talking about Benoit specifically, but a very general statement. Anytime there is somebody who goes on to become a murderer and everyone's saying there are no warning signs, they always say the same thing about him. Well, he was a very quiet guy. He was a very private guy. But that's exactly what happened with the Benoit murders. But I do believe that WrestleMania is mostly correct with their observations, talking about head injuries, steroid use, drug use, and the unknown dark side. And the unknown dark side is something that is really difficult to put into words because it could mean that somebody might have some type of mental issue, whether it's anger, resentment, or being prone to being angry or resentment. Like, have you ever heard the expression, oh, the person has lots of rage inside of them? And when I begin to think about times when I get angry or times that I've been angry in the past, I don't exactly feel like there's rage inside of me. It's rather that some outside force is contributing, or that there is some outside external factor that is making not only me angry, making other people angry, and that people can be set off and triggered very easily. And because this is a true crime channel, I talk a lot about true crime cases with you guys. There is something that comes up very frequently, and that is the concept of a rage killing where somebody just loses it. There's a domestic dispute that goes on with people and somebody just snaps, and then they go on to commit a murder, and they didn't even mean to. It wasn't planned. It's just they got so angry that they lost awareness of their mental faculties. They didn't believe that they were going to be taking it that far. And that is very well what could have happened in regards to the Benoit murders. But some other questions that were examined were in relation to the hectic lives of these WWE wrestlers, as well as all professional wrestlers across the circuit. I think it was probably the first interview that I ever watched from a pro wrestler, and it came from Trish Stratus, the multi-time women's champion, when she said that the best thing about being a pro wrestler was getting to see the world. The worst thing was about it was getting to see the world, but not actually getting to see the world. They're just flying to different countries all the time, and they're performing all the time. And even what you see on the television, like WWE Raw, and they had ECW on Tuesday nights, which Chris Benoit was actually his final days were on Tuesday night ECW, and as previously stated, he was to compete for the ECW championship. And then they had Friday Night SmackDown, but they also do things that are not aired. They're called house shows, and it's a very, very hectic schedule, and I mean many, many days a year. And wrestling doesn't have an off season, and some things changed because of the pandemic, but this is all back in 2007 when this is going on. The NFL gets criticized all the time for head injuries and concussions, and now they have concussion protocol. However, they have an off season. Many other sports have an off season. And pro wrestling is very, very vigorous, and it takes an enormous toll on the body. As far as drug use and steroid use, the wrestler Hardcore Holly, also known as Bob Holly, made a statement in response to steroid use in wrestling and other types of drug use in wrestling when he said, every single pro wrestler has taken some type of drug at some point, has taken some type of banned substance at some point, because they are trying to deal with the pain. And I also remember an interview with Nelson Frazier Jr., more famous for being Viscera and Big Daddy V, and Mabel, of course, in the WWE, when he said, ask any surgeon about the worst injuries that he has seen, and he most likely will say that they have come from wrestling, from either pro wrestling or similar styles of wrestling. It may be in some of the smaller brands and some of the more local events, but this WWE style of wrestling goes on to have an enormous amount of injuries. And I was discussing this with a friend from high school, actually, and he made a very bold statement when he said that he thought that WWE was more dangerous than MMA because, I mean, for starters, the MMA wrestlers do not compete. MMA wrestlers, excuse me, MMA fighters don't compete as frequently as the WWE wrestlers. And also, when you're having mixed martial arts, as well as maybe some other things like the K1 Grand Prix, they're not using blunt objects. I mean, they're not using barbed wire, and they're not also doing the things like the diving headbutt as committed by Chris Benoit multiple times. I mean, it is more about a genuine fighting competition, and there's a certain degree of truth to that. Say, for example, somebody jumping off a ladder, or somebody getting hit in the face with a ladder like Joey Mercury, who had a broken nose. If you ever do watch that, that is still rated as one of the worst wrestling injuries of all time, when Joey Mercury was hit in a ladder by Jeff Hardy, but I don't mean to go down too much of a technical path with the wrestling discussions, but some other factors that were stated in regards to why Chris Benoit committed the double murder of his wife and son, as well as committing his own suicide, relate to some issues in his own personal life. One of his best friends was the wrestler Eddie Guerrero, and that same friend who made the comment about how WWE is more dangerous than MMA was just really sad one day. I got on the school bus and he's all looking sad and down and dejected and crestfallen. And I said, "Hey, what's up? What's wrong?" And he said, "Do you know Eddie Guerrero?" And I was like, "Yeah, he's a wrestler. Yeah, WWE, right?" And he said, "He died." And he was feeling beaten up about that. And Eddie Guerrero is one of the most loved professional wrestlers as well. And Chris Benoit remained very close to the Guerrero family. As I said, prior to his own death, he called Chavo Guerrero and said, "I love you." And I believe that one was actually left as a voicemail, but don't quote me on that specific detail. And as far as that, I mean, like, someone losing one of their closest friends could have had a strong impact. But here is something that I have not seen in any of the other sources, and it relates to a very devastating neck injury that Chris Benoit had. And I did an episode about this, an old black box recording called Chris Benoit Neck Pain Leading to Murder, because I found a TNN special that had been uploaded onto YouTube called Worst Pro Wrestling Injuries, and it featured a segment from Chris Benoit when he talked about how he severed his neck, and the injury, like the disc from his neck, went into his spinal column, and it created an enormous amount of pain. That is almost a direct quotation. I'm paraphrasing just a little bit of it. But he had a very famous neck injury, and the pro wrestler and multi-time champion Edge said after Chris Benoit's death that when Edge had his own neck injury, he went to Chris Benoit. He was the guy who talked to him about it, who just shared everything. Is it normal for my fingers to be tingling and such? And Chris Benoit again was a very big mentor and a very big supportive individual. And if you ever do watch that segment, that testimonial, which was shared in the 2007 tribute that the WWE did to Chris Benoit before they decided to remove his image, they you can just see the pro wrestler Edge just crying and just breaking down because he lost such a close friend. And I'll never forget this. I'll never forget this. That one started out by saying, he started the testimonial by saying, "I've always said that there are three people that I can turn to, and now two of them are gone." It was just so saddening. And the world of wrestling, they're pro wrestlers and they work together, and they compete together, and people develop relationships, and they're advisors and mentors and people who have strong bonds. And as previously stated, the death of Eddie Guerrero could have strongly affected Chris Benoit. But back to the neck pain issue. After I heard that segment on TNN, which had been shared on YouTube, about how he was experiencing a lot of pain after his neck injury, I decided to get on Google.com and just look up, is there a connection between neck injuries and mental health issues? And you would not believe how many sources came out. One of them off the top of my head is from the National Institute of Health. NIH talks about how neck injuries can have an increase in anxiety and depression in the person who has them. Maybe a better way of phrasing that is that a neck injury can lead to an increased amount of anxiety and depression in the injured person while the person is recovering. And with Chris Benoit, it seems like there were very clear escalating factors that his mental state was deteriorating. And as I said, people were just simply asking questions. They were simply just trying to identify why this tragedy happened from someone who seemed very balanced and also very orderly, because characteristic that I think I heard this from Chris Jericho was that Chris Benoit had multiple children, and he would always want his sons to wear a suit when they would come by the wrestling ring, just very old-fashioned with manners and values. But in terms of that, this is something that I didn't share in any of the previous episodes. I saw a clip from Paul Heyman, also known as Paul E. Dangerously, and Paul Heyman was talking to people about the Benoit murders, and someone made a comment to the effect of that Chris Benoit was a good person, but he did something bad in reference to the murders of his wife and son. And Paul Heyman, again one of the most famous promoters in wrestling history, just flat out said, "No, I don't want to hear it." And they're like, "Well, why not?" And he said, 3 people died in that house. 3 people died because of that man. The third person meaning Chris Benoit himself. But what he truly meant to say was that this is a person who had a choice. He had conscious actions. He had a certain amount of awareness of his mental faculties. Yes, you can talk about CTE. Yes, you can talk about drug use and steroid use. But he just flat out said, 3 people died because of this person. That's bad. He was a bad person. You do not need to defend him or give any praise toward his moral character. He went on to become a murderer. However, what Paul Heyman also said in that very same statement was, you want to talk about wrestling, you want to talk about being in the ring, Chris Benoit was one of the top 5 wrestlers that Paul Heyman had ever seen. And Chris Jericho openly went on national television, as previously stated, saying it was widely accepted at the time that in 2007, prior to Chris Benoit's death, prior to the murders and his own suicide, he was regarded as the best wrestler in WWE, the best technical wrestler in the WWE, and that's what Paul Heyman was talking about. And somebody wrote out in the comments section here on YouTube that it's like, you have to separate the stuff from the stuff, and Paul Heyman just did with that comment. He viewed him as one of the best wrestlers and performers of all time, but also saying absolutely nothing praiseworthy of his moral character. And I think that ties right back into WrestleMania's point about the hidden dark side, that someone had destructive tendencies. And also, though, there's something else that was just shared in a comment about the Zodiac Killer on this channel. Every Monday is Zodiac Monday here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. And somebody said that in a double murder, one victim is the target and one victim is in the wrong place at the wrong time. And for the longest time, I thought that would have been Daniel Benoit, that his son, his child, his son who was still a kid at the time, I thought he was the target and he was the first person murdered, that there's some type of incident where the kid's misbehaving or the kid's not doing what the father wanted and Chris Benoit just snapped and went into the rage. But if you were to get on Chris Benoit's Wikipedia, if you were to get on the Wikipedia for the Benoit murders, I believe it's actually on that page, it says very clearly that the medical examiners have determined that Nancy Benoit was the first victim who was killed, meaning that she would have been the target and the other victim is in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that perhaps it was more of a marital dispute as well as a result of a child misbehaving. And this is another issue that happened in 2007. We had this explosion of the internet with Wi-Fi and with people sharing things on social media. I mean, lots of us had Facebook, and people were still sharing stuff on AOL Instant Messenger at the time, but they also had MySpace and all types of other ways of sharing stuff via social media. So what did people do with the internet? They started to share theories about these crimes. And I remember that this one guy from the United Kingdom was proposing the idea that it was actually Nancy Benoit who had murdered Daniel Benoit, that the mother had murdered her son, and then Chris Benoit simply freaked out and he retaliated in a defensive way and then got really freaked out and began to panic because he had just killed his wife, even though he was defending his son, and that he would then planned his own suicide. That was the theory written by this guy, and the only reason why I'm telling you he was from the UK was his post was filled with a lot of very, very British expressions and so on, using the word wanker in a lot of context. And I openly decided to post something. This is one of the first times I participated in a true crime discussion on the internet when I said, I think that it's nearly impossible and almost ridiculous to say that Nancy Benoit could have murdered her son because a medical examiner, can determine whether or not someone has been strangled or asphyxiated by a man or a woman. And as the Wikipedia page states, this is something that we have learned since that post came out in late 2007, that Nancy Benoit was most likely murdered first, but a medical examiner can determine that if, at the time, we thought that a type of wrestling choke had been used on Daniel Benoit, or even if he's been asphyxiated, the amount of force that has been used. They talk about this stuff on forensic files all the time, or watch Dateline in 48 Hours when they interview forensic scientists. They talk about this stuff all the time. There are marks that are left behind, the amount of pressure that is left behind is more likely to have come from a person of Chris Benoit's size versus Nancy Benoit's size. This is just basic forensics 101 from not even someone who is a scientist. I'm not a scientist. I'm just somebody who watches true crime programs. I think that those types of alternative theories are absolutely ridiculous. And even more so, there was this very, very big detail. This relates to an online theory that Chris Benoit was actually murdered. Somebody had written out a 25-point list, which I read off in a previous episode here on Black Box Online Radio, about the reasons why they thought that there was some type of conspiracy involved, or that there was some type of cover-up taking place where somebody murdered Chris Benoit and framed him for it. And a big piece of evidence that was cited in that 25-point list was that Chris Benoit committed suicide by hanging, but a type of cloth or padding had been placed around his neck before he decided to make the noose and hang himself from the weight set. And this person was proposing that that made absolutely no sense. That was inconsistent with how they believed that somebody would have committed suicide. And I disagree with that completely, because the statement that was actually written out on that list was that if somebody were going to commit suicide, why would they care about bruising? And I believe that final part is almost a direct quotation. Why would they care about bruising? That is not correct information at all. Again, as someone who follows true crime cases, it's also normal for people to place a pad or a cloth around their neck if they're going to try and attempt suicide, because they do not believe that they can tolerate the pain necessary to actually break their own neck by hanging. And a very clear example of this is the story of Lyle Stevick, the man who was unidentified for a while. Lyle Stevick was an alias that he used, and he committed suicide actually by hanging himself with a belt, and there was this cloth that had been tied around his neck, and people were just asking that same question in a different case, in an unrelated case, and they were saying that, well, doesn't that seem odd? No, that is done because the person doesn't believe that they can tolerate the amount of pain to either break their neck or go through the process of strangulation. They want it to be as painless as possible when they're trying to take their own life. Suicide is the direct option. Death is the direct option, and they're trying to use a very lethal and effective method, and that is definitely what they are seeking to do. But the reason why I'm talking about that is some people view certain acts of certain attempts of suicide as a cry for help. That's the expression that is used. And I've never liked that expression, a cry for help. And I'm sure you've heard that some people commit suicide with non-lethal methods, and they're doing it as a cry for help, and I don't like that term because it makes it sound like it's all about attention or they just want somebody to recognize them. Instead, perhaps we should focus on the different factors in life and look at how some people might actually be experiencing nervous breakdowns, like genuine nervous crises that are going on in their lives, and they're operating with impaired judgment. And they're not thinking very clearly, and also there is a certain amount of fear that people would have, even if they're expecting that they're going to die, but in terms of fear of experiencing the pain, And that's why some people would try and use certain methods to commit suicide that are less painful, but they're going to be less lethal. And I mean, I'm really not trying to talk about any of these statistics that really have certain implications, but if maybe we can do that in a future episode. But this whole concept of it's a cry for help, I think that misrepresents the situation and it truly downplays what people are actually experiencing. But that's just my take on the subject. And if anybody has any comments about everything that I've said so far, whether it's talking about the info that I had just shared or anything in relation to the Benoit murders, please put your ideas in the comments section down below. I would love to read them, and I would love to know what you think. But if we're going to examine a true crime case like the Benoit murders and look at how there are an enormous amount of contributing factors, then we should also be aware that there are an enormous amount of contributing factors to why people would plan suicides or try to attempt suicide in certain ways. That's what life is about, multiple contributing factors. And if you're going to say that it's not, that just falls into the black and white fallacy. Well, it's this or that. And that's not how we live. That's not how human beings operate. And let's just recap all of the possible reasons or the contributing factors that would have driven Chris Benoit to commit these murders and take his own life. Head injuries, drug use, steroid use, the hectic WWE schedule, and the death of one of his closest friends, as well as perhaps some unknown marital problems, as well as perhaps dealing with some type of anxiety and depression from his neck injury. And another final point, a final point that was included in the 25-point list that I was just referencing is talking about how there were beer bottles and alcoholic containers, as I referred to them as, found in Chris Benoit's home prior to his suicide, and they do believe that he was intoxicated, and all of the mental health websites talk about this. They've been talking about this for years, that if somebody is intoxicated, then the likelihood that they will commit a violent action is monumentally higher. That, I mean, people are more likely to do something if they're drunk. I think that that's a widely accepted statement. But I just heard this quotation from somebody recently that drunk actions are sober thoughts. And I used to have my own problems with alcohol, and one point that I always stood by was, I've never done anything intoxicated, never done anything while intoxicated that I did not do while I was sober. Now, that might have been something that creates a type of domino effect in somebody's mind, but it doesn't put the dominoes in place. Oh no, yes, someone's more likely to commit a violent action while they're intoxicated, but, I mean, most people get drunk and they don't kill people. Most people don't get drunk and they don't murder their wife and child. So there are there are pre-existing factors that would drive somebody to commit a type of crime like that would drive somebody to commit a double murder and then hang their own life. And I think that's everything that has been laid out in this particular episode. But what do you think about the Benoit murders? Please share some ideas in the comment section down below. And I'll leave you with one final note, and that is that I do a regular segment about Jack the Ripper every Wednesday on this channel, Ripper Wednesday, and one of the sources that I had encountered in that is a book that was written by Alison Bruce that is called Billington Victorian Executioner. And when I was on that page, on just reading about the book, I saw that one of the sources that had been cited was a book called Ring of Hell, which was talking about the Benoit murders, and I thought, how odd. And even on the Wikipedia page for James Billington, again, he was a Victorian executioner, it talks about how some of his descendants went on to become WWE wrestlers, WWF at the time. The most famous one was Davey Boy Smith, but then some of his descendants also married into the Hart family, yes, like Bret Hart and Owen Hart, and I just thought that was rather odd, and I didn't expect to see that book, Ring of Hell, listed as one of the sources talking about a Victorian executioner, but 3 years ago, I said, it's been 5 years, and I keep saying that I wanted to read the book Ring of Hell, which is talking all about this particular case, the Benoit murders. Now it's been 8 years, almost 9 years since I've been saying that. And yes, it's on my radar. It's just that I do these segments about the Zodiac Killer every Monday and Ripper Wednesday, talking about Jack the Ripper. So I do follow a lot of those true crime cases, and I read a lot of those books. But this is a story, though, that I don't think is going away anytime soon, because it's not only the WWE. As previously stated, the NFL has a lot of discussions about head injuries and also about concussions, CTE, and how this drives people to go on to commit violent crimes. Not only murder, but other physically violent crimes. Anything that is involving physical violence, contact sports, all across the board are having these types of discussions. But with some things that we've learned is just that things are very, very rough on the WWE wrestlers, and they live very hectic lives. They are rewarded for it financially. Some of them who actually make it to the higher end of the spectrum who go on to become quote unquote WWE superstars. But I also remember back in my heyday of wrestling fandom that there was this promo that showed John Cena falling and injuring his leg, and it said, "What they do in the ring tears their bodies apart. Do not try this at home." Something to that effect. Someone's talking in some really weird and creepy voice. But that's the honest answer. That's the honest answer. Even though wrestling is staged and there's a script and the matches are worked and they use the term kayfabe, meaning that it's not real or that it's not like a real emotion that people are experiencing, a lot of the pain that you actually see is real. A lot of the blood is real. And of course, the broken bones are real. And as previously stated, Chris Benoit had a devastating neck injury, not to mention a host of other experiences that he had. But I would love to know what you guys think about this particular subject. And I mean, what are your thoughts on the Benoit murders? What are your thoughts on any of these issues in regards to concussion protocols and other contact sports like the NFL? You can also share any particular theory that you have about how and why these crimes were committed, and also about how should this story should be remembered. Because in a previous episode on Black Box Online Radio, I was asked the question, where it was posed by a different media platform: should Chris Benoit be put in the WWE Hall of Fame? And he was someone who was a very accomplished wrestler, as I said, former world heavyweight champion, and also had very good success with WCW. And my answer was no, that these events should disqualify him from being in the Hall of Fame, and that his death and his double murder and the double murder of his wife and son should be excluding factors. But if anyone has a response to that, I would like to read that in the comment section down below. And you can also follow the show on Facebook. There's also a page called Black Box Online Radio on Facebook, and I'm going to be releasing more reels on Facebook as well as on Instagram, on the Reels page there, and the short episodes are going to come out on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube here on the Shorts page, and they're going to be out a little bit more frequently. And there is always BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com, the email address you can use to get in touch with me over there, and lots of ways to keep in contact. Please feel free to visit some links in the description box, including BuyMeACoffee.com for the membership. There's also the book Killer on a White Horse, the novel that I have written, and I'll see you over on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.